Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? It wasn't hostility. Not really. It was habit, a subtle, quiet thing that lived in the way the others leaned toward each other when they talked strategy, their voices dropping to a low hum that never quite reached her seat at the end of the table. Tessa Rivera had been part of this team for 3 years. She'd earned her trident the hard way. She survived Hell Week, passed sniper selection, and hit more confirmed targets than anyone else in the unit that year. But in rooms like this, rooms full of men who didn't mean disrespect but didn't know how not to give it, she still had to remind herself that silence wasn't invisibility. She watched the flickering blue light of the projector as it threw maps of a jagged valley onto the wall. The Panchir region, remote, unforgiving, mountains rising like teeth. On paper, it looked like terrain made for ghosts, a place where men disappeared. She knew that kind of land. It had no mercy for arrogance. 3 days in and out, Commander Webb said, tapping the laser pointer on the screen. 6 operators, small footprint. We infiltrate at night, collect intel on the facility here. He circled a small cluster of structures, and exfil before dawn on day 3. No direct engagement unless compromised. Straightforward. That word always bothered her. No operation in terrain like that was ever straightforward. Webb's eyes swept the table. Rivera, you'll provide overwatch from this ridge line. High angle, but it gives us eyes on the compound and both approach routes. Santos will handle navigation. Torres, your breacher. Mitchell, medic and secondary shooter. Chen's on comms. 6 names. 6 moving parts of a fragile machine. Tessa nodded once. She didn't need to say much. Her job was clarity, to see what others couldn't and end threats before they had a name. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. Something that had followed her from her last deployment, a shadow in her peripheral vision that came alive every time she closed her eyes. A shot she hadn't taken, a life she couldn't save. She told the therapist it was fine, that she'd compartmentalized. The truth was simpler. She'd buried it deep enough that only silence could touch it. That night in the barracks, she cleaned her rifle one last time. The Mk-13 Mod 7 lay across her lap, every piece meticulously inspected, oiled, and reassembled with reverence. It wasn't a weapon to her, not really. It was an instrument of control in a world that spun too fast. Every motion of maintenance slowed her heart. Every click, every slide was a promise, precision under chaos, control under fear. She thought of something her instructor had said years ago at sniper school. You're not shooting at a person. You're removing a threat to your team. But never forget, the distance doesn't absolve you. It just delays the reckoning. Back then, she hadn't understood what he meant. Now she did. The helicopter lifted off from Bram Airfield just after midnight. 6 figures, gear tight, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the open doors. The wind was cold, sharp, tasting of iron and dust. Tessa sat near the edge, night vision goggles down, the rifle between her knees like a promise. Below them, the terrain was pure shadow, deep valleys and broken ridges illuminated only by the occasional glint of moonlight on stone. 10 minutes to LZ, the crew chief called out, his voice nearly lost in the roar. Webb leaned forward, his face dimly lit by the red cabin light. Eyes up, everyone. Remember, stealth is survival. We go dark the second we land. Rivera, your point once we're on foot. She nodded again, heart steady. The others might have felt the nerves. She didn't. Not yet. For her, fear always came later, in the silence after the gunfire, when the echoes of the dead lingered. The insertion went clean. Too clean, she thought later. No eyes, no sound, no dogs barking in distant villages. Just stillness. The kind that feels like something waiting. They moved through terrain that broke the body and tested patience. Narrow goat trails, rock faces that crumbled underfoot, sharp winds that carried whispers from nowhere. By dawn, they'd reached the abandoned shepherd's compound, their hide site. From there, she could see almost the entire valley. 1,000 yards of brutal beauty. She set up her rifle, checked ranges, adjusted elevation. The others unpacked surveillance equipment, antennas, and comms gear. Within hours, they were inside the rhythm of a mission: observation, documentation, silence. For 2 days it worked, smooth, efficient, almost boring. They recorded movement at the training facility, intercepted radio chatter, marked enemy patterns. Every night, Tessa logged her observations in her small, weathered notebook, a habit she'd picked up long before the Navy. She wrote in small, precise handwriting. 4 vehicles arrived at 200, 2 left before dawn, no external sentries, possible command post north building. There was comfort in the discipline, in recording what was real, what could be measured. But on the 3rd morning, something shifted. She didn't hear it, she felt it. The wind carried a different kind of stillness. The birds had gone silent. She adjusted her scope toward the western ridgeline. Nothing, just empty rock. Then Chen's voice came softly through the comms, picking up chatter, multiple units moving. They're saying they know. Her stomach tightened. Repeat that. They know we're here. A long pause, the kind that stretches seconds into forever. Webb didn't waste time. Pack it up. We move now. Backup extraction point is 8 clicks northeast. But before she could even close her notebook, Tor's voice cracked through the comms, tense, clipped. Contact, South Ridge, 20+ vehicles. That was how it started. At first just dust trails. Then figures, dark silhouettes dismounting, spreading, moving with purpose. By the time Tessa reached her elevated perch, she could see 3 different groups converging from 3 directions. 60 men, maybe more. Her mind did the math automatically. 10 to 1. No air support for 40 minutes. No retreat that didn't lead straight into their line of fire. This wasn't a tactical error. It was betrayal. Someone had given them away. But she didn't think about that yet. She thought about distance, about angles, about the rhythm of breath. "Rivera, you've got weapons free," Webb said over the net. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it, the kind that comes when a man knows his odds and chooses to fight anyway. "Copy," she answered, sliding her cheek to the stock, adjusting for range and wind. Engaging south. The world narrowed to her scope. The first man appeared clearly at 600 meters, standing near a tree line, gesturing orders. His body language said he was in charge. She inhaled, half-breath, hold. Her finger pressed down smoothly, almost tenderly. The rifle's recoil nudged her shoulder like a heartbeat. Through the glass she saw him drop. No drama, just gravity. "Target down," she said softly. "Not triumph, just fact." Another stepped up, machine gunner setting up behind a rock. She took him next. Then another and another. For a moment it almost felt clinical, a sequence of problems to solve, threats to erase. But then the radio crackled with the sound of her teammates firing from below, the sharp echo of M4s, the thud of grenades. It wasn't numbers anymore, it was chaos. "Tessa," Mitchell called over comms, her voice tight, breathless. "They're flanking from the west." Tessa shifted, scanning. Yes. Movement. 10 fighters pushing low through broken terrain, out of her line of sight. "Santos, cover the west," she said quickly. "You see them." "Copy, we've got contact." The next minutes blurred, muzzle flashes, distant shouts, the occasional scream cut short. Tessa's rifle worked like a metronome. Every pull of the trigger, another heartbeat. But even as she fired, something gnawed at the back of her mind. Not fear, something colder. Who told them? Because this kind of convergence wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Someone out there knew exactly where 6 SEALs were hiding. And that meant this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about exposure. She reloaded, the motion automatic. Her breathing never wavered, but her heart began to feel heavy. Every man she dropped was another answer to the same question. How much longer can we hold? 40 minutes to CAS, Chen said, voice shaking. We just have to hold. Just. She almost smiled at that word. Below, the compound walls trembled from impacts. AK fire cracked against stone. Dust filled the air like smoke. Webb shouted orders she barely heard, each one a thread keeping the team tethered to discipline instead of panic. Tessa adjusted her scope again, 600 meters, wind picking up, shadows shifting. Through her lens, the world had become pure geometry, distances, angles, trajectories. But beyond the math, she saw something else. Faces, eyes, not the faceless silhouettes from training, real men, breathing, afraid, angry. For a second, her focus faltered. The face of a young fighter appeared in her crosshairs, barely 20 maybe. She hesitated, a heartbeat too long. He raised his weapon. Her finger moved. The recoil hit harder this time. She blinked, steadied her breath. South Group reorganizing, she reported quietly, forcing her voice steady. More vehicles moving in. The sun was sinking lower. Shadows stretched long over the valley. In the fading light, the battlefield looked almost serene, like a painting. But serenity was an illusion. The world was about to break open. Hold them, Webb's voice came through. No matter what. She didn't answer, she didn't have to. Because this was her purpose, the thin line between her team and oblivion. And she would hold that line, one shot at a time, until nothing moved but the wind. But somewhere beneath the rhythm of the rifle, a thought pulsed in her mind, one she couldn't silence, no matter how steady her hand stayed. What if we weren't supposed to survive this? How long could a person stay calm when the world was falling apart around them? Tessa didn't know. She just knew she couldn't afford to be the first one to lose control. Her rifle was burning hot. The air around her smelled of metal and dust. Brass casings lay scattered like gold teeth in the dirt. Below her position, the compound was alive with noise, the mechanical rhythm of gunfire, the hard echo of grenades, the shouted commands that carried authority even through panic. North Group advancing, Torres yelled over the radio. Copy, Webb barked back. Mitchell, keep pressure west. Rivera, shift north if you can. She shifted, slow, deliberate. Her cheek found the stock again. The scope was her only world. She saw movement, shadows sliding through a ravine, cautious but steady. They were learning, not charging blindly now, using terrain, coordination. That told her something terrifying. This wasn't a random militia swarm. These were trained fighters. She adjusted windage, range, elevation. Her mind worked faster than thought, a practiced, instinctive sequence. 250 meters, slight angle, half-value wind from the east. She fired. The man leading the group folded mid-step. The next one froze, confusion flashing across his face before instinct drove him to the ground. She fired again. Dust erupted beside his head. Third shot hit. 3 down north, she said, voice calm, though her hands trembled between shots. The ravine went quiet, but quiet didn't mean safe. It meant they were regrouping. Below, Mitchell's voice came through, breath ragged. We're low on grenades. Santos took a hit, arms bleeding bad. Keep him stable, Webb ordered. We're not losing anyone. Tessa glanced down. Through the dust, she could see the faint silhouette of Mitchell crouched beside Santos, her hands moving fast. The sight stung. Not because of fear, but because she couldn't go to them, couldn't help. All she could do was protect them from a distance and pray she didn't fail. A round cracked past her ear, so close it felt like the air itself had punched her. She ducked behind the wall instinctively, the stone splintering beside her head. The echo rolled off the mountains. They'd found her position. Contact on sniper perch, she called, sliding lower. They've got eyes. You need to relocate, Webb asked. Negative, they'll expect that. I'll make them think they missed. Her voice was steadier than her pulse. She waited silent, 10 seconds, 20. Then she rose just high enough to bring the scope up again. The shot that had nearly killed her came from the southern tree line. She found it a faint glint of glass, a scope reflection. Counter-sniper. She exhaled. The irony wasn't lost on her, the hunter being hunted. Through her lens, she could just make out a face, young, still, waiting for her to show herself again. She almost admired his patience. She didn't give him the chance. She shifted 6 inches left, angled off a reflective rock and fired. The glint vanished. Counter-sniper neutralized, she whispered. Good work, Webb replied, but his voice was distant, distracted. They're moving again, East Ridge, more vehicles. The ground trembled faintly under her knees, not from fear, from engines. She turned her scope east, and her heart dropped. Trucks, 3 of them, technicals with mounted guns. 60 had just become 80, maybe more. Chen, Webb said, we need that air support faster. Closest Apache are still 20 out, F-16's 40. Then we fight until they get here, Webb said simply. Rivera start thinning the herd. That was the thing about Webb. He never yelled, never pleaded, just gave orders like each one was inevitable, and somehow that steadiness kept everyone breathing. Tessa lined up her next shot. The lead vehicle stopped at the tree line, gunner climbing into the bed, hands steady on the heavy machine gun. She aimed low at the engine block, 3 rounds. Smoke, the gunner bilayed, coughing. A 4th shot took him down as he hit the ground. Another truck pulled up behind it, then another. She fired again and again. It wasn't perfect shooting, it was controlled desperation. Her world narrowed to the rhythmic sequence of breath and trigger, breath and trigger. Between shots, she could hear the others, Torres shouting as he reloaded, Mitchell yelling for more bandages, Chen muttering coordinates into his radio like a prayer. Every sound was life, and she was fighting to keep it from going silent. Minutes bled together, she didn't count them anymore, she only counted targets. Each pull of the trigger was another thread, in a fragile barrier between order and collapse. Then over the radio, a voice she didn't recognize, static, broken, unfamiliar accent. In English, Americans, you are surrounded, lay down your weapons. It wasn't bravado, it was certainty. They believed they'd already won. Tessa stared at the distant line of fighters, still moving, still forming up. For a split second, she thought about what surrender would even look like, about the slim, impossible chance that they'd let them live. But the thought dissolved instantly. She'd seen what happened when SEALs were captured. She knew. Not today, she whispered. Webb's voice came through, tight and resolute. They think they have us surrounded. Let's prove them wrong. And somehow in that one sentence, the air inside the compound shifted. Fear became focus. Desperation became defiance. Tessa found the commander again, a man shouting orders from behind a fallen log. She recognized him by the confidence in his stance, by the way the others deferred. She took the shot. He dropped mid-command, his hands still pointing forward. The entire assault line hesitated. Leader down, she said softly, South group pausing. Copy, Webb replied. You just bought us time. But time was running out faster than bullets. Her magazine was nearly empty. She reloaded, her hands slick with sweat and grime. She'd fired 35 rounds since contact. She'd hit nearly every one. And still they kept coming. The sun dipped lower, bleeding red light across the valley. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Beauty and death, hand in hand. For a moment she thought about home. About the small house she hadn't been to in years, her father's old chair still sitting by the window. About the letter she'd never sent her sister, the one that was supposed to explain why she stayed in the Navy, why she kept going back. She told herself it was duty. That was the clean answer, the one people could understand. But the truth was darker. She stayed because the battlefield was the only place where her thoughts went quiet, where guilt didn't find her. A distant explosion yanked her back. Grenade west side. Santos, she shouted. I'm good, came the answer, strained but alive. They're testing the wall again. She wiped dust from her scope, sighted in. Through the haze she saw them, silhouettes moving between boulders, advancing in pairs. Her shots came quicker now, 2 seconds between, one breath, one trigger press. One down, another. But with each shot, her heart began to feel heavier. Not from fatigue, from awareness. Because every man she stopped was just another reflection of herself, someone who believed he was fighting for something worth dying for. And somewhere in that symmetry, something inside her began to fracture. 30 minutes to CAS, Chen reported. We just have to hold a little longer. 30 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Tessa, Mitchell called over comms, voice softer now. You good up there? I'm fine. You don't sound fine. Fine enough. Keep breathing, Mitchell said quietly. They need you. The words hit harder than any bullet, because they were true. Her whole purpose in that moment was distilled into one fragile truth. They need you. She adjusted her scope, scanning the tree line again. More movement. She fired. Another target dropped. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but she ignored it. Below, the team fired in short bursts, controlled, disciplined, the rhythm of survival. She could feel the sun dying behind her, shadows swallowing the valley inch by inch. The temperature dropped, the world went blue. And with the fading light came a strange, hollow calm, the kind that happens when there's no room left for fear. She breathed it in, let it steady her. Because the next wave was coming, she could feel it. And when it did, they would be ready. But as she reloaded her last magazine, her hands briefly paused. There was a question she couldn't push away anymore. What happens when the shooting stops? When the adrenaline fades, when silence falls, what's left of the people who survive? She didn't know, maybe no one did. But for now it didn't matter. Survival came first, reflection could wait. Through the scope she saw new shapes forming at the tree line, more fighters arriving, trucks unloading. 80 had become 90. Her finger found the trigger again. Webb, she said quietly, they're not giving up. Neither are we, he replied. And that was enough. The sky turned black, the valley disappeared. And somewhere, deep in that darkness, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not despair. Resolve. The kind that lives in people who have nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. She steadied her breath, adjusted her aim. And as the first muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning, she whispered into the dark. Come and find me. The first tracer ripped across the night sky like a comet. For half a second it was beautiful, a thin arc of orange fire cutting through blackness, and then the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire hammered the walls, dust filled her lungs, the mountain itself seemed to shake beneath the weight of violence. They were coming. Tessa, north and west, they're moving, Webb's voice snapped through her headset. Hold positions, everyone fire discipline. Copy, she whispered, settling back behind the scope. The valley had vanished beneath darkness, but her world was alive with light. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning through her lens. Shadows moved in erratic bursts, pausing behind rocks and dead trees, then rushing forward again. She didn't need to see their faces anymore. The movement alone was enough. Range 220, wind minimal, she adjusted. One squeeze, one recoil, a shadow fell. Again 2, 3. Her breathing slowed until the world around her began to fade into rhythm, the pulse of her own heart syncing with the distant percussion of the fight. She wasn't afraid, not now. Fear was a luxury. But she was tired. God, she was tired. The last daylight had died over an hour ago, and with it went her sense of time. Every minute had become a lifetime, every reload a heartbeat. Below, the team fought in the dark, muzzle flashes lighting their faces in split-second snapshots. Chen's radio hissed constant static as he relayed coordinates. Mitchell moved from body to body, her silhouette crouched and rising, the red glow of a headlamp flashing briefly before vanishing again. And Webb, always in the center, always the voice of calm amid the storm. "Keep your spacing," he shouted. "Stay low, we hold the line." Hold the line. Tessa heard the words but didn't really feel them anymore. The phrase had become something abstract, a mantra repeated long past the point of exhaustion. She fired again. A figure staggered backward, dropped, and didn't rise. Her shoulder burned from the recoil. Her neck ached from staying low behind the rifle, but she didn't move, couldn't. Every time she blinked, the inside of her eyelids filled with ghost images, flashes of movement, the curve of a muzzle flash, the fall of another body. She stopped thinking about winning. The only goal left was duration. How long could they survive before time or ammunition or luck ran out? Another burst of fire erupted from the south ridge, a heavier sound now, deeper, more mechanical. "Machine gun," Torres shouted. "They've got a PKM on the tree line." Tessa rotated instantly, eyes straining through the dark. The night vision scope painted the world in eerie shades of green and black. She caught the faint shimmer of the weapon's muzzle. 600 meters. Long shot, poor light, moving target, but she didn't hesitate. She adjusted for drop, squeezed the trigger, and missed. A faint puff of dust 10 feet short. She cursed under her breath, chambered another round, fired again. This time she saw the spark, the gunner jerking backward, the machine gun falling silent. "Target down," she reported. "You're saving our asses, Rivera," Torres panted through comms. "Keep singing that song." But his voice was different now, stretched thin, more breath than confidence. They were all wearing down. From her perch, she could see the outlines of their movements inside the compound. Shadows darting between cover, returning fire, reloading. The air reeked of cordite and dust. The wind carried the faint, metallic taste of blood. For a moment, everything blurred, the landscape, the sounds, the meaning of it all. And then something sharp cut through her focus, a scream. "Mitchell!" "Medic down," Torres yelled. "She's hit." Tessa's pulse spiked. She swung her rifle, scanning, searching. She found Mitchell crumpled near the east wall, motionless, Santos dragging her backward by the vest. "Where's the shot from?" she demanded. "Ridge line north, I can't see them." Tessa adjusted instantly. Through her scope she caught flickers of movement, 3 silhouettes advancing low, using the slope as cover. She centered on the first and fired. He dropped. The second hesitated, fatal mistake. The third turned to run, she caught him mid-step. Silence again. Her chest hurt. Not from the fight, from the weight of hearing Mitchell's breathing, shallow and labored, over the open comms. "I'm okay," Mitchell gasped finally, voice trembling. "Shoulder, just keep shooting." Tessa closed her eyes for one heartbeat, then opened them again. "Copy, keep shooting." That was what she did, what she'd always done. But something inside her cracked a little at the sound of Mitchell's pain. Because she'd heard it before in a different voice, a different place. Her mind flashed back to Iraq, a building collapse, her previous team, a brother in arms pinned under rubble, bleeding out as she covered his position. His voice breaking over comms, whispering her name. And her promising she'd get him out. She hadn't. And every shot she took since then had been a kind of penance. Now, the echoes of that guilt mixed with the present, Mitchell's shallow breaths merging with the memory of the man she'd failed to save. Her hands began to tremble, not from fear, from memory. She forced her breathing steady again, one inhale, one exhale. Focus, target, purpose. Rivera, Webb's voice grounded her again. You good? Still here? That's all I need to hear. She swallowed hard and sighted in again. The southern tree line flickered with more muzzle flashes. The next assault wave was forming, larger this time. Dozens, maybe more. They were coordinating, setting up heavy weapons, moving with confidence. Chen, how far out is CAS? Webb demanded. 10 minutes, Chen replied. They're inbound at full burn, just hold. 10 minutes, it might as well have been 10 hours. The enemy wasn't waiting anymore. They were advancing, firing, shouting to each other in a language Tessa couldn't understand, but the meaning was universal. They believed they had victory in sight. Tessa switched to faster rhythm. The rifle bucked over and over, targets fell. The line slowed, staggered, then surged again. Tor's voice broke through. West wall's getting chewed up. We can't hold if they get closer. Do not break contact, Webb ordered. We stay anchored here. A grenade exploded near the entrance. The ground shook. The sound was so loud it swallowed the world for a heartbeat. When it cleared, Tessa's ears rang, but she didn't stop. She fired blind for a second, then found her rhythm again. Her scope lens smeared with grime. She wiped it clean with her glove. 3 minutes to CAS, Chen shouted. 3 minutes. 300 heartbeats. Tessa's breath hitched. She could feel the fatigue creeping in now, every muscle shaking, every nerve screaming. But her hands moved with the same calm precision they always did. She was almost out of ammunition, 2 magazines left. She loaded one and paused for just a second, long enough to look down into the compound. Through the dim, smoky air, she saw Webb crouched beside the damaged wall, rifle in hand, scanning sectors calm as ever. He looked up toward her position. Their eyes met for a split second. He nodded. No words, just a nod that said everything were still in this. Something warm rose in her chest, pride maybe, or defiance, she wasn't sure. She turned back to the scope. The next wave of attackers emerged from the tree line, closer now, less than 200 meters. They fired wildly, their rounds sparking off stone and tearing through dry brush. One stumbled, another dropped. The air filled with sound, screaming, shouting, gunfire, chaos. And yet inside her scope everything stayed silent, peaceful almost. It was the strange paradox of her profession. The closer death came, the calmer she felt. Because for a sniper, chaos was clarity. CAS inbound, Chen yelled suddenly, his voice breaking through the static. 2 F-16s on approach. Tessa exhaled, relief washing through her for the first time in hours. Marking targets, Chen said quickly, firing off coordinates. South tree line heavy contact, West ridge secondary. The next sound was indescribable, a low thunder that built into a roar. She looked up just in time to see twin streaks of light crossing the night sky. Then impact. The world became white. The mountains trembled, the air shuddered, and a wall of pressure slammed into her chest. The tree line disappeared in a cloud of flame and dirt. Secondary explosions rippled through the valley, lighting the darkness like sunrise. She flinched back, shielding her eyes, but didn't stop scanning. Through the smoke, she saw what was left: broken shapes, debris, fire. The survivors fleeing in every direction. Direct hits, Chen confirmed. Targets neutralized. Cheers erupted through comms, ragged, disbelieving laughter. Webb's voice cut through it, still calm, still focused. Maintain eyes. We confirm no follow-up threats before extraction. Tessa exhaled slowly. Her body trembled now that adrenaline was fatting. She looked down at her rifle, the metal hot and blackened from constant fire. Her hands ached, her shoulder throbbed, her eyes burned. And yet, all she felt was an overwhelming stillness. Below, Mitchell leaned against the wall, pale but conscious. Santos sat beside her, his arm bandaged, staring blankly into the distance. Torres crouched near the entrance, his rifle across his knees. Chen, still on the radio, murmured quietly, his words fading in and out with static. They were all alive. Against all logic, they were alive. Tessa looked back toward the burning tree line. Flames licked at the dark sky. The smell of fuel and dust filled the air. She wanted to feel triumph, relief, something clean. But all she felt was emptiness. She had done her job, saved her team. But the images of the men she'd killed, dozens of them, flickered behind her eyelids like ghosts refusing to rest. And somewhere deep inside, she heard her instructor's voice again. The distance doesn't absolve you, it just delays the reckoning. She looked down at her hands, steady, scarred, blackened with soot, and whispered under her breath, almost like a confession. I didn't miss. But the words didn't sound like pride. They sounded like loss. The silence after war always felt wrong. It wasn't peace, it was something else, something heavier. The kind of quiet that pressed against your chest until it hurt to breathe. Tessa sat behind her rifle, her hand still resting on the stock, the barrel still smoking faintly in the cold night air. The echoes of the explosions had faded into the mountains, but they seemed to live inside her skull, replaying again and again. Shockwaves turned into memory. Below, the compound was still. The others moved like ghosts, slow, deliberate, cautious, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile quiet they'd earned. Chen was still on the radio, his voice hushed. Viper flight is RTB. CAS will orbit for 30 mics. Extraction ETA 25. No one replied. There was nothing left to say. The valley that had tried to kill them was burning. Flames licked at the southern tree line, devouring what remained of vehicles, bodies, and debris. The orange glow painted the mountainside in a dull, pulsing light that looked almost alive. Tessa watched it without emotion. She'd seen fires like that before, after strikes, after ambushes, after mistakes, but this one felt different. Maybe because she'd survived it. Maybe because she wasn't sure she deserved to. Her rifle rested across her lap. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, more real. She ran her hand along the cold metal, tracing scratches she hadn't noticed before. This weapon had been her lifeline, her voice, her only control in a world collapsing around her. And now that the noise had stopped, she didn't know who she was without it. Rivera. Webb's voice pulled her back. She looked up. He was standing a few yards below, helmet off, face streaked with dust. His eyes were bloodshot but steady. "You good?" he asked quietly. She wanted to say yes. She always did. That word had become a reflex, the armor she wore long after the shooting stopped. But tonight it wouldn't come. So she just nodded once. Webb studied her for a long moment, then looked away. "We'll move in 15. Prep your gear. Birds inbound." She nodded again, but her hands didn't move. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to leave the valley behind. 15 minutes before silence became distance, before everything that happened here turned into something that couldn't be explained, only remembered. She sat there watching the flames, listening to nothing. And then faintly a sound. Footsteps. Torres climbed up the incline toward her, cradling his rifle in one arm. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. "Thought I'd find you up here," he said, his voice rough from smoke. "Where else would I be?" He gave a tired half-smile. "Probably somewhere smarter, we're clear, no more contacts." She nodded, "I know." For a while they just sat there, two figures outlined against the dying light. "You saved us," he said finally, "all of us." She didn't answer. "I mean it, Tessa. Without you we'd be—" He stopped himself, gesturing vaguely toward the valley. "You know." "I was doing my job," she said softly. "Yeah, but not everyone does their job like that." There was sincerity in his voice, but also something else, something that sounded like guilt. He'd been the one on the wall. hearing her rifle crack over and over, watching bodies drop through a scope he couldn't see through. "Doesn't feel like saving," she said quietly. "Not when you see what's left after." He looked at her for a long moment, then lowered his eyes. "Guess that's the difference between us. You see the faces." She didn't respond. He sighed, rubbed his eyes, and stood. "Bert'll be here soon. I'll help Santos with Mitchell. You should get your gear ready." She nodded, but he didn't move right away. "Hey," he said after a pause, "don't carry all of it, okay?" She looked at him, confused. "All this," he gestured to the valley. "What happened? What didn't? Don't let it stay on you forever." He turned and walked back down before she could answer. Don't let it stay. But that was the thing, it always stayed. The faces, the sounds, the smells, they didn't vanish when the mission ended. They just found places to hide inside you. She finally began packing. Slow movements. Every piece of gear felt heavier than it had hours before. When she slung the rifle over her shoulder, her knees buckled slightly, not from pain, but from exhaustion so deep it felt like gravity had changed. When she reached the compound, the others were ready. Mitchell's shoulder was bandaged tight. Santos looked pale but stable. Chen's hand still shook as he secured his radio pack. Webb did a final sweep, checking for anything sensitive left behind. No one spoke. Words didn't belong here anymore. The helicopter came in low, its rotors thundering through the valley, scattering ashes and smoke into the air. The sound was deafening, but somehow it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. They moved fast. Loaded gear helped the wounded climb aboard. When the skids lifted off the ground, the entire team leaned back as if their bodies were finally remembering how to let go. As the compound fell away beneath them, Tessa looked down. The fire still burned, a long scar of light stretching across the valley floor. From above, it didn't look like a battlefield anymore. It looked like something ancient, a ritual, a warning. She watched until the flames blurred into distance, then into darkness. Only then did she exhale. Torres sat across from her, head against the bulkhead, eyes closed. Chen stared at the floor, his fingers twitching unconsciously. Mitchell was awake but silent, her gaze unfocused. Webb sat near the door, eyes scanning the horizon as if he couldn't stop even now. And Tessa, she sat with her rifle between her knees, hands folded loosely around it, her eyes empty. Her mind wasn't in the helicopter. It was still back there, in the silence between gunshots, in the breath before every trigger pull, in the moment right after a man fell and she had to find the next. She'd done everything right, every calculation perfect. And still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had been left behind, buried somewhere in the smoke and the dirt. Bram Airfield smelled like jet fuel and cold metal. They landed just before dawn, the horizon still gray and uncertain. The flight crew helped unload the wounded, the medics rushing in with stretchers. Webb handled the formalities, reports, debrief, logistics. Tessa followed in silence, her rifle slung low, her boots leaving faint tracks in the dust. They passed other teams preparing for missions, fresh uniforms, clean weapons, easy laughter. She caught fragments of conversation, weather, food, home. She wanted to hate them for their calm, but she couldn't. They didn't know yet. In the hangar, an officer she didn't recognize handed out water bottles and protein bars. "You all did good work," he said. "Intel confirms high-value casualties." "Good work." Tessa took the water but didn't drink it. The words rang hollow. She found a corner, sat down, and rested her back against the wall. The concrete was cold, grounding. She closed her eyes, but the moment she did, the images returned, the tree line, the counter-sniper, the flash of eyes before the shot. Her body flinched like each memory was a physical blow. Someone sat down beside her, Mitchell. "You okay?" the medic asked softly. Tessa didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, "You ever get tired of surviving?" Mitchell frowned. What do you mean? Every mission, every close call, everyone says we're lucky. But it doesn't feel like luck, does it? It feels like loss with better timing. Mitchell didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. They sat in silence, two soldiers breathing the same heavy air, both alive, both changed. After a while, Mitchell whispered, "You did what you had to do. You kept us alive." Tessa opened her eyes, staring at the hangar's ceiling, streaks of oil and dust catching the early light. "Yeah," she said quietly, "that's what I keep telling myself." The sound of rotor blades faded somewhere in the distance. Another team leaving, another story beginning. She wondered if they knew the cost of what they were walking into. Because it wasn't just about survival, it was about what you brought back, the things you couldn't talk about, the memories you didn't put in after-action reports. And for Tessa Rivera, the cost wasn't measured in medals or commendations. It was measured in faces. The ones she couldn't save, and the ones she couldn't forget. That night she lay awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, the others asleep. Her rifle leaned against the wall beside her bunk, cleaned, oiled, silent. She reached out and touched it. The metal was cold, lifeless almost, but her fingers lingered there as if part of her was afraid to let go. Because when the rifle wasn't in her hands, the silence came back. The kind that wasn't peaceful, the kind that whispered all the things she tried to ignore. She turned her head, staring at the faint moonlight spilling through the small window. The world outside looked calm, innocent, untouched. But she knew better. Somewhere beyond that horizon, another valley waited, another mission, another impossible decision. And she would go again. Because that's what she did. That's who she was. Even if she didn't know why anymore. The clock ticked softly on the wall, steady, patient, indifferent. She closed her eyes, not to rest but to hide. And in that half-dreaming darkness, she heard the whisper of her instructor's voice again, echoing like a truth she couldn't escape. The distance doesn't absolve you. She didn't answer it, didn't argue. Because deep down she already knew. Sometimes survival isn't victory. Sometimes it's just endurance. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Under the fluorescent lights of the debriefing room, everything looked too clean. White walls, metal chairs, the hum of an air conditioner that was always too cold. Tessa sat in the corner, her uniform freshly laundered, the sharp creases at odds with the bruises on her arms. The officers at the front of the room spoke in low tones, scrolling through digital maps, replaying drone footage, highlighting trajectories and blast patterns as if the entire battle could be condensed into neat geometry. She knew what they wanted: clarity, precision, the kind of detached analysis that turned chaos into data. But all she could think about was the smell: burnt soil, oil, hair. "Rivera, your engagement records show 87 rounds expended," one of the analysts said, looking up from his tablet. 73 confirmed hits, outstanding marksmanship. The word hung there, outstanding. Tessa nodded once. It was the only thing expected of her. Webb leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his face unreadable. She could tell he was exhausted too, but he hid it better. Commanders always did. "Petty Officer Rivera," another officer continued, "walk us through your first target engagements after contact was confirmed. Start from the southern ridge." Her jaw tightened. 600 meters, she said flatly. First target appeared to be a squad leader, shot one center mass. Immediate drop, engaged PKM gunner next, then shifted west to intercept flanking movement. Her voice sounded mechanical, detached, like she was reading from someone else's notes. They nodded, typing. "At what point did you identify a counter-sniper?" She hesitated. 5 minutes after initial contact, south tree line, estimated range 650. Result: neutralized. More typing, more nodding. The questions went on. Minute details about wind, elevation, ammunition, optics. It was all procedure, all necessity. The kind of sterile reconstruction meant to make sense of violence that refused to be logical. After an hour, the tone softened. "Rivera," one officer said, "your actions prevented your team's position from being overrun. Command will be recommending commendation for valor. You should know that." Commendation. Another word that didn't mean what people thought it did. "Understood," she replied quietly. They dismissed her with a polite smile. "Good work, petty officer. You can get some rest." She stood, saluted, turned for the door. Her knees ached as she walked out. The hallway beyond the debriefing room was dimly lit, silent except for the echo of her boots. Outside, the night air hit her like cold water. The base smelled of fuel and dust. Distant engines rumbled, and somewhere, music drifted from a hangar, someone's attempt at normalcy. She wanted to join them, to feel the laughter, but she couldn't. So she walked toward the firing range instead. It was empty at this hour. The soundproof barriers muted even the wind. She stood at the edge of the lane, staring at the target silhouettes in the dark. She'd spent years perfecting this, turning breath into control, turning control into accuracy. But now, every silhouette looked like a question. She loaded one round, just one, a ritual. Breathe in, exhale halfway, hold. The rifle cracked through the quiet, the sound echoing longer than it should have. When the target reeled back, she lowered the rifle and closed her eyes. She didn't feel satisfaction, just the familiar ache of recoil in her shoulder and the hollow certainty that even perfection didn't mean peace. Weeks passed. Awards were processed, reports filed. The mission became just another entry in a long archive of operations no one outside their circle would ever read. Tessa spent her days in routine, training, cleaning, briefings. She smiled when required, answered when spoken to, slept when exhaustion finally won. But the nights were different. Sometimes she'd wake up with her hand clenched like it was still holding the trigger. Other times she'd see flashes, dust swirling, fire rolling through the valley, the brief instant when she'd locked eyes with a target before the shot. She tried not to think about it, but memory has its own gravity. It pulled her back whether she wanted it or not. One night, Mitchell found her outside the barracks, sitting alone near the airstrip. "You ever sleep?" the medic asked, lighting a cigarette. "Sometimes." "Same." They sat in silence for a while, watching the faint red blink of a distant tower light. "They said you're up for a Silver Star," Mitchell said finally. Tessa gave a small, humorless smile. "Yeah, feels weird." "Why?" "Because it's a medal for surviving." Mitchell exhaled smoke, the wind catching it before it reached the stars. "It's for keeping us alive, Tessa. You earned it." Tessa looked down at her hands. "You ever think about them? The ones we fought?" She nodded. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah, more than I want to." "Me too." The medic glanced at her, studying the tension in her jaw. "You can't carry all of them." Tessa's voice was almost a whisper. "Then who does?" Neither had an answer. The night stretched on, heavy and endless. The ceremony came a month later. Dress uniforms, brass polished until it gleamed, cameras, applause. Tessa stood at attention as her name was read, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. The words felt foreign, detached from what they described. When the medal was pinned to her chest, the metal was cold against her skin. Applause filled the hangar. People smiled. Photographers flashed lights. But inside, she was back in the valley, dust rising, hands trembling, breath steadying, the taste of fear and focus on her tongue. When the ceremony ended, Webb approached her. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were tired. "Proud of you," he said. She nodded. "Thank you, sir." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Not everyone would have held that long. You did what no one else could." "Someone had to," she said softly. Webb studied her. "You ever talk to anyone about it?" She shook her head. "You should," he said gently. "Doesn't have to be today, just don't let the silence take over." She gave a small nod, but they both knew she probably wouldn't. Some burdens couldn't be spoken, they could only be carried. After the ceremony, she went back to her quarters. The medal lay on the table, catching light from the window. It was beautiful in a way, symmetrical, perfect. But when she looked at it, all she saw were numbers. 60 fighters, 40 minutes, 47 confirmed. She turned it over in her hand. The engraved words were supposed to mean honor. To her, they felt like a tally. She placed it back on the table and sat on the bed. The silence pressed in again. A knock at the door broke it. Tor stood there, hands in his pockets. "We're grabbing a drink," he said. "You should come." She almost said no, but his eyes, tired, kind, made her hesitate. "Just one," she said finally. They ended up at the small on-base bar, dim lights, old country songs humming through bad speakers. The team was there. Mitchell's arm still in a sling. Santos laughing for the first time since the mission. Chen nursing a beer like it might bite. For a while they talked. Not about war, not about medals, just about stupid things, food, movies, what they'd do if they ever stopped deploying. It almost felt normal. Then Torres raised his glass. "To Rivera," he said. "To the best damn sniper I've ever seen, the reason we're all still here." They all joined in, voices warm and grateful. "To Rivera." Tessa smiled because it was expected, but inside something twisted. She looked around the table, at these faces she'd saved, and realized she'd never felt more alone. Because for them the story was over, a chapter closed. For her it was still happening. Every night, every silence, every heartbeat between blinks. When the night ended, she walked back alone. The medal still waited on her table, gleaming faintly in the dark. She sat down beside it, staring at her reflection in the polished metal. It didn't look like victory. It looked like consequence. And as the night deepened, she finally whispered the truth she'd been avoiding since the valley. Courage is what keeps you alive. It's what kills the part of you that can't pull the trigger. She closed her eyes. And in that moment the silence wasn't empty, it was honest. The weeks after the medal ceremony unfolded in fragments. Small, ordinary moments that should have felt safe but somehow didn't. The clink of silverware in the dining hall, the metallic smell of the armory, the way everyone said congratulations as if it could erase what had happened. Tessa moved through it like a ghost in daylight. She ran laps around the perimeter at dawn until her lungs burned. She sat through briefings that blurred into noise. At night, she cleaned her rifle piece by piece, even though she hadn't fired it in a month. Sleep came in broken flashes. Sometimes she'd wake gasping, her finger twitching toward a trigger that wasn't there. Other times she'd dream of stillness, the valley quiet again, her scope trained on nothing but wind. Those dreams always ended the same way, with silence so deep it felt like punishment. When people passed her in the hall, they smiled politely. "Hero," they whispered. "Legend." She learned to smile back. That's what they needed. But she had stopped believing in legends. One morning, she found herself sitting alone at the firing range again. The target stood unmarked in the distance. She didn't load the rifle. She just sat there, elbows on her knees, staring downrange as if the landscape might answer something she couldn't ask out loud. "Thought I'd find you here." Webb's voice. He carried 2 cups of coffee, steam curling into the cold. He set one beside her without asking. "Still chasing ghosts?" he asked. She didn't look up, something like that. He sat beside her. The air between them hummed with quiet. "You know, the first time I pulled a trigger in combat, I thought it would feel heroic." Tessa glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead, eyes distant. It didn't, he said. It just felt permanent. She nodded slowly. You ever stop hearing it? The shot. The silence after. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, you just learn to live inside it. They sat there until the sun climbed high enough to burn the chill away. Neither spoke again. When he finally stood, he said quietly, You've done your part, Rivera. Don't let this place convince you that pain is proof of duty. After he left, she whispered into the emptiness, Then what else is there? No one answered. Days bled into each other. Her hands began to shake when she tried to write reports. She missed meals. She started skipping briefings. The others noticed. Torres dropped by her room one night, half a beer in his hand. We're heading into town, he said. Come with us. A few hours off base won't kill you. She almost said yes. Then she looked at the rifle leaning in the corner. I'm good, she said. Next time. He studied her for a long moment. You can't keep hiding behind that thing. But she already had. That night she sat on the edge of her bed, hands clasped. The medal still hung on the wall, catching faint light. She thought about the day she earned it, the smell of gunpowder, the burn in her shoulder, the scream of jets overhead. The moment when survival had felt less like victory and more like obligation. She whispered, I didn't want it to end like that. The words surprised her. They sounded small, fragile. Maybe she wasn't talking about the battle at all. A month later, she was called back to Bram for an assessment. Standard post-deployment review, they said. The psychologist's office was painted soft blue, as if color alone could heal something invisible. A small fountain trickled in the corner. Dr. Keller smiled kindly. You've had quite the year, Petty Officer Rivera. Tessa nodded, so they tell me. Let's talk about the mission. She gave the same summary she'd given intelligence. Distances, coordinates, procedure. When Keller pressed, and how did it feel, she hesitated. Like math, she said finally. Just numbers that meant whether someone lived or died. The doctor studied her, and afterward. Quiet. Does the quiet bother you? She looked at the small fountain, the constant trickle of water that pretended to be soothing. Yes. They sat in that answer for a while. Finally, Keller said, You know, trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It waits until you're alone, then asks what it all meant. Tessa almost laughed. And what if there's no answer? Then maybe the question changes, Keller said. She was supposed to feel better after that. She didn't. But she kept showing up, talking, listening, sometimes even sleeping. Small victories. On weekends, she volunteered at the range for new recruits. She taught them breathing techniques, trigger control, patience. They called her ma'am and watched her like she was untouchable. One afternoon, a young woman stayed behind after class. How do you stop thinking about it? The recruit asked. The first time you take a shot. Tessa looked at her. The kid couldn't have been more than 20, clean uniform, unbroken eyes. You don't, Tessa said softly. You just learn what it costs and you decide if you can keep paying. The recruit frowned. Was it worth it? Tessa thought about the valley, the fire, the faces. I don't know yet, she said. That night she found herself walking the perimeter road again. The wind carried the smell of rain, the sky bruised with distant lightning. She reached the far edge of the base where the fence met open land. Beyond it, the world stretched empty and wild. For a moment she imagined just walking, leaving the noise, the expectations, the medals, the ghosts. But she didn't move, because leaving wouldn't change what was inside her. She looked up. The clouds parted briefly, revealing a sliver of moonlight. She whispered, if you can hear me, but didn't finish. She didn't know who she was talking to, God, the dead, herself. Maybe all of them. She stood there until the first drops of rain touched her face. They felt clean, real. And for the first time since the valley, she let herself cry. Not loudly, not desperately, just quietly, like something inside her was finally thawing. Each tear carried the weight of a name she never learned, a promise she couldn't keep, a shot she couldn't take back. When the storm passed, she felt lighter, not whole but human. She turned back toward the base, the lights glowing faintly through the rain. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a ghost. Just a person walking towards something she didn't yet understand. Later that week, Webb found her again. "We're rotating new teams through," he said. "They could use someone with your eyes." She studied him. "You think I'm ready? I think you're honest enough to teach them what matters." She considered it. Training meant responsibility without the trigger, guidance instead of fire. Maybe that was the closest thing to redemption she'd get. "When do I start?" she asked. "Monday." He smiled faintly. "Good to have you back." On her first day, she stood at the edge of the training field, watching the new recruits struggle through obstacle courses. Their laughter carried on the wind. One of them waved. "Ma'am, are you the sniper from Panchir Valley?" She paused. "That's what they tell me." "What was it like?" another asked. She looked out at the open field, the sun warm on her face. "It was necessary," she said after a moment, "but not something to chase." They nodded, not really understanding. How could they? She watched them run, stumble, laugh again. The world kept moving. And she realized maybe that was the point. Survival wasn't about forgetting. It was about continuing despite the memory. When the session ended, she walked to the range alone, set up a target, loaded one round. Not to test herself, not to relive anything, just to listen. Breathe in, exhale halfway, hold. The shot cracked, echoing across the field. This time she didn't flinch. She smiled, small but real. Because for the first time, the silence after didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. The morning started before sunrise now. By the time the recruits arrived, Tessa had already walked the range, checked the wind, and watched the first light slip across the horizon. She liked that hour, the world balanced between dark and day, everything still possible. The new class was restless, eager. They talked too loud, moved too fast, reminded her of ghosts she didn't want to name. One of them stood apart, a young sniper candidate named Rylan Park. Early 20s, sharp eyes, the kind that never stayed still. She reminded Tessa of herself before she learned that stillness was the real weapon. Rylan was good, too good. Every shot neat, every answer memorized, confidence spilling into arrogance. When she spoke, her tone carried that familiar edge, the belief that skill alone could outrun consequence. Tessa saw it immediately. And it scared her. After the first week, she called Rylan aside. "You shoot like you're proving something," she said. Rylan shrugged. "Aren't we all?" "Maybe at first," Tessa said, "but if that's all you've got, it'll eat you alive." The younger woman frowned. "I'm not afraid of the job." "You shouldn't be," Tessa said quietly. "You should respect it." For a second, Rylan's confidence cracked. "Is that what happened to you? You stopped being afraid?" Tessa looked downrange. Targets shimmered in the heat. "No," she said. "I just learned what fear's worth." Over the next month, she taught in small ways. How to breathe between heartbeats. How to read terrain like language. How to wait, not just for a shot but for understanding. The recruits respected her, but Rylan watched her differently. There was curiosity there, and something heavier. One afternoon after drills, Rylan found her cleaning her rifle. "Can I ask you something?" Tessa didn't look up. "You just did." Rylan smiled faintly. "They say you held off 60 fighters, alone." "That's not how it happened." "But it's true you were outnumbered." "Yes. And you did miss." Tessa's hand stilled. "Everyone misses something." Rylan waited. "Then why keep doing this? Why stay?" Tessa looked at her. the same restless defiance she'd once worn like armor. "Because walking away didn't fix anything," she said, "and maybe teaching means someone else won't have to carry what I did." Rylan nodded, but her eyes still searched for heroism. Tessa didn't offer any. Training season bled into autumn. The air grew colder, sharper. Leaves gathered against the firing berms. One morning, word came from command, an exercise gone wrong at a nearby training zone. 2 casualties, 1 sniper candidate missing. It was Rylan. They found her hours later, pinned behind a ridge during a live fire simulation that had spiraled into chaos. A communications failure, a misfire, a string of bad luck. Tessa rode out with the recovery team. When they reached the ridge, the wind was howling. Rylan crouched behind a rock, her rifle beside her, eyes wide and empty. She was unhurt but trembling. The other team hadn't made it. When Tessa touched her shoulder, Rylan flinched. "It's over," Tessa said softly. Rylan stared at her. "I couldn't move," she whispered. "I froze. I thought I was ready. I was." Tessa knelt beside her. "No one's ready until it happens, and even then you never really are." "I thought you'd be disappointed," Rylan said. Tessa shook her head. "No, I'm relieved." "Why?" "Because now you understand." That night back on base, Rylan came to her again. Her uniform was clean, but her eyes were raw. "How do you live with it?" she asked. "The fear, the noise." Tessa hesitated. Then she said the truest thing she knew. "You stop trying to live with it, you live after it." Rylan frowned. "Is there a difference?" "Yes, after means you carry it, but it doesn't carry you." Rylan nodded slowly. Then, almost a whisper, "Did anyone ever tell you that?" Tessa smiled faintly. "No, I had to learn the hard way." Rylan's expression softened. "You saved me today." Tessa shook her head. "No, you saved yourself. I just reminded you how." Rylan left and the barracks grew quiet. Tessa sat alone, the faint hum of the night pressing against the windows. She picked up her rifle, ran a cloth down the barrel, then stopped halfway. Her reflection glimmered in the scope glass, older, lined, human. She whispered, "Maybe that's enough." Weeks later, the unit held a memorial for the 2 who hadn't made it back. The flag, the folded triangles, the silence before the bugle, all of it familiar, ritualized, unbearably precise. Rylan stood stiff beside her, tears streaking her face. When the ceremony ended, she looked at Tessa. "How do you keep doing this?" Tessa stared at the horizon. "By remembering why it matters." "And why does it?" "Because every name called here deserves someone who still believes it did." That evening, Tessa walked the range again. The air smelled of cold earth and cordite. She stopped at the firing line, watching the distant silhouettes fade into dusk. She thought of all the faces, those she'd lost, those she'd taught, those she'd never known but could never forget. When Rylan approached quietly behind her, Tessa didn't turn. "You coming to dinner?" the younger woman asked. "In a minute." Rylan hesitated. "You'll never tell them what really happened in Panchir, will you?" Tessa smiled without looking back. "They already know enough." "You ever wish it had gone differently?" Tessa lowered her gaze to the rifle resting across her knees. "Every day." "Would you change it?" She thought about that, really thought. The noise, the fire, the impossible odds, the choice that had kept them alive. Finally she said, "No, but I wish it hadn't needed to happen." Rylan nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the difference between killing and surviving." Tessa looked at her then, and for the first time she saw not herself, but hope. "Maybe so," she said. They stood there as the sun disappeared. No gunfire, no orders, just wind across the range and the long, steady quiet of people still learning how to live. Later, alone in her quarters, Tessa opened the small box that held her medal. She traced the edges, the engraved words dulled from handling. It no longer looked like burden. It looked like proof, of something endured, not glorified. She closed the box gently, set it beside her rifle, and turned off the light. The darkness wasn't threatening anymore. It was simply dark. And for the first time, she slept without dreaming of the valley. She woke before dawn. The room was still, the air cool, the faint hum of the base generators pulsing through the concrete floor. For a long time she didn't move. She just lay there, eyes open in the half-dark, listening to her own breathing. It was even now, not the ragged, shallow rhythm that used to follow her from sleep. She sat up slowly, swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her rifle stood in its usual place by the door, the case open but untouched. The metal box beside it caught a sliver of the first light, not shining, just there. It had been 3 years since the valley. 3 years since the night that refused to leave her. Now most days, it was just a whisper. She washed her face, pulled on fatigues, tied her boots. Habit, precision, small rituals that still mattered. Outside, the horizon was barely awake. The sky was bruised purple and silver, and the air carried that clean, sharp smell that came only before sunrise. She walked toward the range out of instinct. No orders, no schedule, just gravity. The field was empty, dew collecting on the berms, flags hanging limp. She set her rifle on the bench, but she didn't load it. She sat beside it, elbows on her knees, watching the light change. She used to think meaning came from motion, from targets hit, missions completed, medals pinned. Now she wasn't sure. Maybe it lived in the pauses between. Footsteps crunched behind her. She didn't need to look to know it was Webb. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Didn't try," she said. He came around, leaned against the table. His hair was grayer now, his uniform softer around the edges. They'd both changed. "I heard your transfer papers came through," he said. Tessa nodded. "Civilian Training Division, off base. Permanent, as far as I know." He smiled faintly. "You ready for that?" "I think so." She looked downrange. "Maybe it's time to stop teaching people how to survive and start teaching them how to come home." He nodded, quiet approval in his eyes. "You know, when we first deployed together, I thought you were the calmest person I'd ever met." "I wasn't calm," she said. "I was afraid. I just got good at hiding it. That fear kept us alive." She gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe, but I don't want it to be the only thing that does." They stood together, watching the sky turn gold. "Take care of yourself, Rivera," Webb said finally. "You too, Commander." He offered his hand. She shook it, firm and steady. Then he left, his figure fading into the light. For a long time after, she stayed there. The sun rose higher, the air warming. She opened the rifle case. The weapon gleamed in the new light, faithful, familiar. She ran her thumb along the barrel, then closed the lid gently. It wasn't surrender, it was release. By noon, she was on the transport out. A small civilian flight, the kind with rattling windows and worn seats. She sat by the window, watching the base shrink below her, concrete, dust, order. The place that had built her, broken her, saved her. Clouds swallowed it whole. The man in the seat beside her glanced over. "You military?" "Used to be." He nodded politely. "You miss it?" She thought about the question, about the rhythm of missions, the weight of duty, the taste of dust in the back of her throat. "Parts of it," she said. "What part?" "The people." He smiled. "You sound like an officer." She laughed softly. "Just someone who learned the hard way what matters." Her new post was quiet. A training facility on the coast, mostly recruits who'd never seen combat. The air smelled of salt instead of smoke. At night, she could hear waves instead of gunfire. She spent her days teaching precision, patience, humility. Not the kind that came from obedience, but the kind that came from understanding consequence. The recruits liked her. They said she had calm eyes. Sometimes Rylan sent messages from her own assignment, a few lines about progress, frustration, gratitude. Tessa always replied, "Keep breathing, keep learning." Each letter ended the same way, "You're doing fine." One evening, months later, she walked the beach alone. The tide was low, the sand cold beneath her boots. In the distance, thunder rolled over the water, soft and far away. She stopped, watching waves collapse and rebuild, over and over. The sound reminded her of gunfire, but also of heartbeats. She realized she no longer felt the urge to count. A shadow passed above her, a bird, silent against the fading sky. She followed it until it vanished into the horizon, and she smiled. Not everything needed a target. That night, she wrote a letter she knew she would never send. It wasn't to command, or to the team, or to the dead. It was to herself. She wrote about the girl who had sat at the briefing table years ago, the one nobody listened to, the one who had learned to make silence her weapon. She wrote about the valley, about fear, about the exact moment when she'd realized courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, almost invisible. She wrote about forgiveness, not from others but from herself. When she finished, she folded the paper neatly and placed it inside the rifle case. Then she locked it, set it beneath her bed, and turned off the light. At dawn, she rose again. No alarm, no orders, just the rhythm of habit. She walked to the bluff overlooking the sea. The horizon burned pink and gold, the world clean and endless. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air that didn't taste of metal. Below, the waves moved in perfect silence. And for the first time, she didn't think of the valley. She didn't see faces or smoke or fire. She saw light. Simple, ordinary, beautiful light. She closed her eyes and whispered to the wind, not as confession, not as prayer, just as truth. Sometimes we don't win by fighting. Sometimes we win by coming home. She let the words fade, carried away by the breeze. And when she opened her eyes again, she smiled. Because dignity, she finally understood, doesn't shout. It doesn't need applause or orders or medals. It simply stands. It breathes. It continues. And in that quiet morning, with salt in the air and sunlight on her face, Tessa Rivera finally did the same.